The French Revolution. For centuries, truth and error had been in competition amongst the nations of Europe. This was certainly true in the nation of France. In the 13th century, the Church of Rome had removed the scriptures from the people, making possession of a Bible illegal. The Bible indicates that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. When one removes truth, the result is ignorance. As truth was removed, atheism began to take root. In particular, in the nation of France, the realities of atheism and increased ignorance were further swelled by the persecution of the Huguenots. This group of people, largely Protestant, were persecuted mercilessly across the centuries. Pictured in this scene is the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which took place in the 16th century, where tens of thousands of Huguenots were murdered in the middle of the night for their Protestant faith. As persecution increased, Huguenots were imprisoned, tortured through the Inquisition, or exiled. It was to uphold the throne, preserve the nobles, and maintain the laws that the sword of persecution was first unsheathed in France. Little did the rulers of the land foresee the results of that fateful policy. Intellectual Protestants, professors, statesmen began to leave the country for safer lands. Similarly, much of the skilled trades began to leave the country. The Huguenots were master watchmakers, and as they began to flee the nation, many of them moved to the nation of Sweden. Thus today, watchmaking and Sweden are often synonymous. With the flight of the Huguenots, a general decline settled upon France. Flourishing manufacturing cities fell into decay. Fertile districts returned to their native wildness. And intellectual dullness and moral declension succeeded a period of unwanted progress. It was also at this time, especially in the large French cities, that licentiousness and vice became characteristic of the people. The sanctity of marriage and the family began to decline as vice greatly increased. One group that flourished during this period were the Jesuits, a counter-Reformation arm of the Catholic Church. But as time went on, throughout the 17th and 18th century, more and more of the governments in Europe saw the Jesuits as a subversive group and began to expel them from the various nations of Europe. This also occurred in the nation of France, as on April the 1st, 1763, all Jesuit colleges were closed. And then in the following year, March 9th, 1764, all Jesuits were required to renounce their belief and faith or be banished from the nation. It is interesting to note that Voltaire, himself a Jesuit, in a letter dated April 2, 1764, predicted the French Revolution only a month after the Jesuits were banished from the nation of France, and is largely seen in history as the driver of the philosophical ideas that spawned and drove the French Revolution. In the late 18th century, the clergy, the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, and the nobles controlled well over 90% of the economy. Compelled at every turn to consult the exclusive interest of the landlords, the lives of the agricultural laborers were lives of incessant work and unrelieved misery. Their complaints, if they ever dared to complain, were treated with insolent contempt. The pleasure of the nobles was considered the supreme law. The farmers and the peasants might starve for aught their oppressors cared. In many provinces, the estates were held by the nobles, and the laboring classes were only tenants. They were largely at the mercy of their landowners. and were forced to submit to their exorbitant demands. As the 18th century progressed, and the nobles and upper class lived luxuriously, tens of thousands of the common peasants became further and further impoverished. The alms and poorhouses swelled. Homelessness became a major issue, especially in the larger cities, including Paris. And it is estimated that at the breaking out of the revolution, 200,000 paupers claimed charity from the hands of the king. Tens of thousands were increasingly dependent upon the king for their daily sustenance and bread. Soup and bread lines became a staple in Paris. The decades preceding the French Revolution saw a rapid escalation in the national debt, which was largely carried by the lower middle class and the peasants. With a depraved and cruel aristocracy and an impoverished and ignorant lower class, the state financially became embarrassed. No prophet's eye was needed to foresee a terrible impending outbreak and crisis. Suspicion of the government was rampant throughout France, as gridlock engulfed the legislature. The king and his court were given up to luxury and profligacy. There was little confidence existing between the people and the rulers. Suspicion fastened upon all the measures of the government as designing and selfish. For more than half a century before the time of the Revolution, the throne had been occupied by Louis XV, who, even in those evil times, was distinguished as an indolent, frivolous, and sensual monarch. To the warnings of his counselors, the king was accustomed to reply, "Try to make things go on as long as I am likely to live. After my death, it may be as it will." Laws and enactments consistently appeared to favor the privileged classes, the clergy and the nobles, at the expense of the peasants. To the populace, there appeared to be a system of near universal corruption, with the clergy and the other privileged classes riding the back of the peasants and the lower middle class. The courts of justice would always listen to the nobles as against a peasant. Bribes were notorious with the judges. Taxes were wrung from the people by the secular magistrates on the one hand, and the clergy on the other. And not half of the tax revenue found its way into the state treasury. Many of the men who were impoverishing their fellow subjects were themselves exempt from taxation and entitled by law or custom to all the appointments of the state. At the opening of the Revolution, by a concession of the king, the people were granted a representation exceeding that of the nobles and the clergy combined. Thus the balance of power shifted to their hands, but they were not prepared to use it with wisdom and moderation. By removing the truth of the scriptures, Rome had misrepresented the character of God and perverted his requirements, and now men rejected both the Bible and its author. The removal of the scriptures resulted in making the populace infidels and revolutionists. Romanism they despised as priestcraft. They beheld the clergy as a party to their oppression. The only God they knew was the God of Rome. Her teaching was their only religion. They regarded her greed and cruelty as the legitimate fruit of the Bible, and they would have none of it. Rome had required a blind faith in her dogmas under the pretended sanction of the scriptures. In the reaction, Voltaire and his associates cast aside God's word altogether and spread everywhere the poison of infidelity. the masses, degraded and brutalized, in their recoil from Rome's tyranny, cast off all restraint. Enraged at the glittering cheat to which they had so long paid homage, they rejected truth and falsehood together. What they desired was revolution. However, when the restraints of God's law were cast aside, it was found that the laws of man were inadequate to hold in check the powerful tides of human passion. The nation now swept on from revolt to anarchy. The war against the Bible inaugurated an era which stands in the world's history as the Reign of Terror. Peace and happiness were banished from the homes and hearts of men. The guillotine was long and hard at work every morning. The jails were filled as close as the holds of a slave ship, and the gutters ran foaming with blood into the sea. All the while, the daily wagon loads of victims were carried to their doom through the streets of Paris. The thirst of the populace for vengeance was only stimulated by the execution of the king, and those who had decreed his death soon followed him to the scaffold. In Paris, one tumult succeeded another, and the citizens were divided into a medley of factions that seemed intent on nothing but mutual extermination. And to add to the general misery, the nation became involved in a prolonged and devastating war. The country was nearly bankrupt. The army had gone unpaid. The Parisians were starving. And civilization was almost extinguished in anarchy and license. When France publicly prohibited the Bible, wicked men and spirits of darkness exulted in their attainment of the object so long desired, a kingdom free from the restraints of the law of God. It was in 1793 that the decree which prohibited the Bible passed the French Assembly. 3 years and a half later, a resolution rescinding the decree and granting toleration to the Scriptures was adopted by the same body. The world stood aghast at the enormity of guilt which had resulted from a rejection of the sacred oracles, and men recognized the necessity of faith in God and His Word as the foundation of virtue and morality. France is the only nation in the world concerning which the authentic record survives that as a nation she lifted her hand in open rebellion against the author of the universe. France stands apart in the world's history as the single state which, by the decree of her legislative assembly, pronounced that there was no God, and of which the entire population of the capital, and a vast majority elsewhere, women as well as men, danced and sang with joy in accepting the announcement. The world would do well to apply the lessons learned by France. Anarchy is seeking to sweep away all law, not only divine but human. The centralizing of wealth and power, the vast combinations for the enriching of the few at the expense of the many, the combinations of the poorer classes for the defense of their interests and claims, the spirit of unrest, of riot, and bloodshed, the worldwide dissemination of the same teachings that led to the French Revolution, all are tending to involve the whole world in a struggle similar to that which convulsed France.